The red dust of South Australia's interior settles on everything. Fence posts weathered grey by decades of scorching sun, the rusted rails that once carried dreams across the continent, and the windowsills of weatherboard houses where hope has grown thin as morning mist. In the township of Wirrabara, where the railway line curves toward the endless Mallee scrubland, Eleanor Ashworth sits at a kitchen table each morning as the kookaburras announce the dawn. The china cup before her holds tea grown cold, forgotten in the ritual that has become her tether to sanity. Before her lies a sheet of cream writing paper, the kind with the faint blue lines that guided her students' penmanship for 37 years. My dearest James, she writes in a careful copperplate hand, the nib of a fountain pen catching slightly on the paper's grain. The words come easier now than they did in those first terrible months after the telegram arrived. We regret to inform you that Lieutenant James Ashworth. The rest had blurred into meaningless bureaucratic sympathy, but the silence that followed, that silence had nearly consumed her. Eleanor is 62, with silver hair pinned in the same fashion she's worn since her teaching days, and hands that still reach automatically for the blackboard pointer that no longer hangs by her door. The schoolhouse where she spent her working life stands empty now, the education department having consolidated the scattered country schools. The children have moved on or moved away, following the railway lines toward Adelaide and opportunity. Only the old-timers remain, and the stubborn ones like herself who cannot imagine any other sky. The wattle is blooming early this year. She continues in her letter, her voice barely disturbing the morning quiet. You always said it looked like scattered sunshine. Mrs. Pemberton's cow got into the vegetable garden again yesterday, and I found myself laughing, actually laughing, at the sight of her chasing that beast with her walking stick held high like a sword. She pauses, listening to the distant whistle of the goods train that still runs twice weekly through Wirrabara, carrying wool and wheat toward the ports. The sound fills her with a longing she cannot name, not quite grief, not quite hope, but something suspended between the two. These letters to James have become her morning prayer, her evening confession, her way of keeping the conversation alive that death had so rudely interrupted. She tells him about the changing seasons, the neighbors' small dramas, the books she's reading from the traveling library that comes through monthly. She never mentions the war, never speaks of trenches or gas attacks or the things that must have filled his final days. Instead, she offers him the gentle rhythms of home, the Australia he died defending but never saw again. What Eleanor doesn't realize, as she folds this particular letter and slides it into an envelope, is that her usual routine will be disrupted today. Mrs. Henderson from the post office is down with a chest cold, and her nephew Billy, barely 16 and eager to prove himself useful, has been pressed into service sorting the mail. Billy's enthusiasm exceeds his attention to detail. When Eleanor drops a letter into the postbox outside McGrath's general store, addressing it as she always does, James Ashworth, somewhere beyond the blue, young Billy assumes it's meant for the James who lives out near the abandoned railway siding at Ucolta. He's heard the adults whisper about the strange bloke who keeps to himself in the old station master's quarters, living like a hermit among the rusted infrastructure of progress abandoned. The letter travels 23 miles south on the afternoon mail run, carried by Tom Winters in his Ford truck that serves as the unofficial postal service for the scattered settlements. Tom has been carrying mail across these red dirt roads for 8 years, and he knows every rabbit warren and creek crossing between Wirrabara and the Murray Mallee. He doesn't question the unusual address. Country folk are known for their eccentricities, and if someone wants to send mail to a ghost town, that's their business. Walter James Ashworth, though he's gone by Walter for so long he sometimes forgets the James part himself, hears Tom's truck approaching long before it reaches the siding. Sound carries differently in the vast emptiness of the Mallee country, and Walter has learned to read the landscape's subtle communications. He has been living in the abandoned station master's quarters at Ucolta for 3 years now, ever since he couldn't bear the press of Adelaide streets and the well-meaning sympathy of friends who had no words for what the war had taken from him. The quarters are solid built, constructed in the optimistic days when the government believed railways would bring prosperity to every corner of the continent. 2 rooms, a veranda that faces west toward the salt lakes that shimmer like mirages in the afternoon heat, and a water tank that catches enough rain to sustain one man's modest needs. Walter has made it comfortable in his particular way, Books arranged on shelves he built from railway sleepers, a vegetable garden protected from the rabbits by chicken wire salvaged from abandoned homestead, and a wireless set that brings him the evening news from Adelaide when the atmospheric conditions are favorable. He emerges from the quarters as Tom's truck rattles to a stop, raising a hand in the laconic greeting that passes for conversation in this country. Tom is a man of few words himself, understanding that some folks have their reasons for choosing solitude. "Got something for you, Walter," Tom calls, extending an envelope through the truck's window. "Don't get much mail out this way usually." Walter accepts the letter with surprise. The last correspondence he received was a government notification about his pension payments, and before that, a letter from his sister in Melbourne expressing concern about his hermit-like existence. This envelope is different. Cream-colored paper, addressed in feminine handwriting that speaks of education and refinement. His name is written correctly, though the address simply reads Ucolta Siding, South Australia. "Bit unusual, that one," Tom observes, lighting a cigarette and settling back against his seat. Billy Henderson sorted it, young Mrs. Henderson's nephew. Might have made a mistake with the delivery, but the name matched close enough. After Tom drives away, leaving only dust motes dancing in the afternoon light, Walter returns to his quarters and examines the envelope more closely. The handwriting is elegant, the kind taught in the better schools, with loops and flourishes that suggest care and time. He is not used to receiving personal correspondence, and something about the letter's weight and texture suggests it contains more than a bill or official notice. He opens it carefully, his callous fingers handling the delicate paper with surprising gentleness. The letter inside is written on matching stationery, and as his eyes move across the lines, Walter feels something shift in his chest, a movement like ice cracking in spring. "My dearest James, the wattle is blooming early this year. You always said it looked like scattered sunshine." Walter reads the letter twice, then a third time, each reading revealing new layers of meaning. This is clearly not intended for him, yet the intimacy of the words, the careful observation of small beauties, the underlying current of loss, these speak to something in his own carefully guarded heart. The letter is addressed to someone called James, who is somewhere beyond the blue, and Walter understands with clarity that surprises him that this is a mother writing to her dead son. He has spent 3 years avoiding exactly this kind of raw emotion, this unguarded expression of grief. Yet something in Eleanor's words, though he doesn't yet know her name, pierces through his careful defenses. Here is someone else who understands that sorrow is not something to be gotten over but lived with, like the persistent ache of an old wound that forecasts changes in the weather. Walter sets a letter on his small kitchen table and walks out onto the veranda, where the evening light is beginning to slant across the Mallee scrub. The salt lakes in the distance catch the dying sun and throw it back like scattered coins. This is the hour he usually devotes to his own careful rituals, checking the vegetable garden, adjusting the aerial of his wireless, preparing his simple evening meal. Tonight, however, he finds himself returning to the letter, drawn by its quiet dignity and the courage it must have taken to write such tender words into the void. By the time full darkness settles over Ucolta Siding, Walter has made a decision that will change the course of 2 lives. He lights his kerosene lamp, draws a sheet of paper from the small supply he keeps for necessary correspondence, and begins to write. "Dear Mrs. Ashworth, I believe your letter was delivered to me by mistake, but having read it, I find I cannot simply return it unacknowledged. Your words about the wattle blooming early, about finding laughter in unexpected moments, these have touched something in me that I thought the war had taken away forever. I did not know your James, but I knew many like him. Good men who deserved to see the wattle bloom again, who should have come home to mothers who waited and watched and kept the conversation alive through letters like yours. If it would not be presumptuous, I would like to offer you this. Your letters need not go unanswered. Not because I can speak for your son, but because perhaps 2 people who understand what it means to live with ghosts might find some comfort in honest words shared between strangers. The evening light here at Ucolta catches the salt lakes and makes them look like pieces of heaven fallen to earth. I thought you might like to know that there are still places where beauty persists, even in the loneliest corners of our continent. Respectfully yours, Walter Ashworth." He signs the letter with his full name, something he hasn't done in years, And as he addresses the envelope to Mrs. Eleanor Ashworth, Warabara, he feels something he had forgotten, the anticipation of connection, the possibility that tomorrow might bring something other than the familiar patterns of solitude. The next morning, Walter walks the 3 miles to the main road to flag down the mail truck, his letter tucked carefully in his jacket pocket. The morning is crisp, the kind of autumn day that makes the Melly country show its hidden beauty. The subtle colors of the scrub, the vast arch of sky that stretches from horizon to horizon without interruption. As he places his letter in Tom's hands, Walter realizes he is holding his breath, as if this small act might disturb the careful equilibrium he has maintained for 3 years. If this story of quiet grief, handwritten letters, and healing through unexpected connection touches your heart, consider subscribing to our channel. Turn on the notifications so you never miss a journey into Australia's forgotten corners. And tell us in the comments, where in the world are you listening from? We'd love to know where our Outback stories are reaching hearts like yours. Chapter 1. The letter that shouldn't have been sent. Eleanor finds Walter's letter waiting for her on a Thursday morning, tucked between a bill from McGrath's store and a circular advertising patent medicine. At first, she assumes it's some kind of mistake. Who in Ucolta would know her name? But when she opens the envelope and reads the careful handwriting within, her hands begin to tremble. The morning routine she has maintained for months suddenly feels inadequate. She sets aside her usual letter to James, half-finished on the kitchen table, and reads Walter's words again. There's something in his phrasing, in the way he writes about knowing many like him, that tells her this man understands the particular quality of her loss. Not the generic sympathy of neighbors who mean well but have never watched their futures disappear in a telegram, but the recognition of someone who has walked through his own valley of shadows. She spends a day in a state of distraction, watering her garden twice and forgetting to eat lunch. Mrs. Pemberton stops by in the afternoon to borrow sugar and comments that Eleanor seems all of a twitter about something. Eleanor makes excuses about the approaching thunderstorm. She can feel it building in the air, the way the leaves on the gum trees show their silver undersides to the wind. That evening, as the promised storm delivers its brief, violent blessing to the thirsty earth, Eleanor sits by a lamp and begins a response. She has never written to a stranger before, not in this intimate way, but Walter's letter has opened something in her that demands an answer. Dear Mr. Ashworth, your letter found me this morning like rain on drought-stricken ground, unexpected and deeply welcome. I had not realized how much I needed to know that my words to James might find understanding in a living heart. You are right that we who live with ghosts must find our own ways of making meaning from what remains. I write to my son not because I believe he reads my letters, but because the act of writing keeps alive the part of me that was his mother, that will always be his mother, I suppose, though the role has changed in ways I never anticipated. You mentioned the Salt Lakes catching the evening light. I remember traveling that way once, many years ago, when my husband was still alive and we took the train to Adelaide for our anniversary. The country seemed so vast then, so full of possibilities. Now I find comfort in its permanence, the way it endures beyond our small griefs and celebrations. I confess I am curious about you, Mr. Ashworth. What brings a man to live alone at an abandoned railway siding? But perhaps curiosity is presumptuous between strangers who have found each other through postal misadventure. If you would not mind continuing this correspondence, I would welcome it. It has been some time since I have written to someone who might actually read my words. With warm regards, Eleanor Ashworth. She posts the letter the next morning, taking care to address it clearly to avoid any further confusion. Billy Henderson is still sorting mail at the post office, and Eleanor speaks to him directly about ensuring proper delivery. The boy nods earnestly, pleased to be trusted with important business. Meanwhile, at Ucolta siding, Walter has spent 2 restless days wondering if his letter was too forward, too presumptuous. He is not accustomed to initiating contact with strangers, and the vulnerability of putting his thoughts on paper has left him feeling exposed. When Tom's truck appears with Eleanor's reply, Walter accepts the envelope with hands that are steadier than he feels. Her response exceeds his hopes. Here is a woman of intelligence and sensitivity, someone who can match his careful words with her own thoughtful observations. When she mentions her late husband and their anniversary trip to Adelaide, Walter calculates the years and realizes she has faced multiple losses. First her husband, then her son. Yet her words carry no self-pity, only the quiet dignity of someone who has learned to carry grief without being crushed by it. That evening, Walter begins what will become a regular ritual. He sets aside an hour after his simple dinner to craft his response, choosing his words with the care of a man who has forgotten how to make conversation but remembers how to think precisely. Dear Mrs. Ashworth, your question about what brings a man to live alone in an abandoned railway siding deserves an honest answer. I came here because the noise of cities had become unbearable. Not the mechanical noise of traffic and industry, but the human noise of conversation that seemed to require responses I no longer knew how to give. The war took more than life from those of us who returned. It took our capacity for small talk, for pretending that ordinary concerns matter in extraordinary ways. Here at Ucolta, the silence is honest. The country doesn't ask me to be anyone other than who I am, a man who has seen too much and learned to find peace in watching the light change across empty landscapes. But perhaps I was wrong to think that silence was the only honest response to what we've experienced. Your letters to James suggest another possibility, that we might speak our truths to the vast indifference of the universe and find, occasionally, that someone is listening. I was a railway signalman before the war, working the Adelaide to Broken Hill line. I understood the language of schedules and signals, the precise communication required to keep trains moving safely across great distances. There's something similar in letter writing, I think, the careful encoding of thoughts and feelings, sent across space to someone who will decode them with equal care. You ask about curiosity between strangers, but I think we are no longer quite strangers. Are we? We are correspondents, united by circumstance and separated by geography. Rather like pen pals in the Lonely Hearts columns, except that our hearts are lonely for different reasons. I hope you will continue to write. Your words bring warmth to this quiet place. Yours truly, Walter. As their correspondence develops over the following weeks, both Eleanor and Walter find themselves living with new purpose. Eleanor begins to plan her days around Walter's letters, timing her visits to the post office to coincide with the mail delivery. She finds herself observing her world more carefully, knowing that she will share these observations with someone who will appreciate their significance. She writes about the changing seasons, the small dramas of township life, the books she's reading. But gradually, she begins to reveal more personal truths. Her loneliness, her struggle to find meaning in days that sometimes feel as empty as the melly country Walter has described. The hardest part, she writes in one letter, is not the missing him, but the missing who I used to be when he was alive. I was someone's mother in a way that gave shape to all my other roles. Now I am a teacher retired, a widow aged, a woman whose primary relationship is with memory. Some days I feel like one of those abandoned homesteads you must see in your travels. Still structurally sound, but no longer serving its intended purpose. Walter's responses grow longer and more revealing as well. He tells her about his daily routines, his small garden, the wildlife that has grown accustomed to his presence. But he also begins to share the deeper truths about his exile from normal social life. I tried to return to railway work after the war, he writes, but found I could no longer bear the responsibility of keeping schedules when I had learned how quickly everything can be derailed. The precision that once satisfied me had become a mockery. What uses punctuality in a world where young men die before their mother's letters can reach them? Here at Ucolta, I have learned to live by different rhythms. The sun rises and sets without consulting a timetable. The seasons change according to laws older than human scheduling. There is something healing in surrendering to these larger patterns, in accepting that some things cannot be controlled or predicted. Their letters begin to arrive like clockwork, Eleanor writing on Mondays and Thursdays, Walter responding on Wednesdays and Saturdays. They develop private jokes, shared references to books they both read, a comfortable intimacy that neither has experienced in years. But it's Eleanor's letter in early June that changes everything. Dear Walter, I must confess something that may seem foolish. Yesterday, I found myself setting 2 places for afternoon tea, as if you might appear at my door for a visit. When I realized what I had done, I sat in my kitchen and laughed until I cried, or perhaps cried until I laughed. I'm not certain there's a meaningful difference. For 3 months now, your letters have become the brightest part of my days. I find myself composing responses to your words even when I'm gardening or cooking or lying in bed waiting for sleep. You have become more real to me than many of the people I see every day in Wirrabara. Is it possible to know someone through letters alone? I feel I know your kindness, your careful intelligence, your particular way of seeing beauty in stark landscapes. But I realize I don't know the sound of your voice, the way you move through your small domain, whether you are tall or short, dark or fair. Sometimes I wonder if this mystery is part of what makes our correspondence so precious. We know each other's minds and hearts without the complications of physical presence. We are purely ourselves in these letters, not the selves that others expect us to be, but the selves we discover in the act of careful writing. Yet I confess I am curious about the man behind the words. Not curious enough to suggest anything improper. We are both too old and too careful for such foolishness. But curious enough to wonder what it would be like to share afternoon tea with someone who understands a particular quality of silence that follows loss. Your devoted correspondent, Eleanor. Walter reads this letter 3 times before the full impact settles in his chest. Eleanor has named something he had not dared acknowledge, that their correspondence has created a kind of intimacy more profound than most physical relationships. She has become essential to his daily life, and the thought of losing this connection fills him with something approaching panic. He begins his response several times, struggling to find words that match the honest vulnerability of her letter. Finally, he writes, "Dear Eleanor," it's the first time he has used a Christian name. "Your letter has been sitting on my table for 2 days while I tried to find words adequate to your honesty. You ask if it's possible to know someone through letters alone, and I believe the answer is yes. But perhaps we know them in a different way, more completely and less completely than we know people we see daily. I know you in ways that matter. Your capacity for finding beauty in small things, your refusal to let grief make you bitter, your courage in reaching out to a stranger who might have ignored your letter. These seem to me more essential than knowing whether you prefer tea or coffee, though I confess I am curious about such details as well. You are right that there is safety in this distance. We can be purely ourselves without the complications of social expectation. Yet I find myself imagining our conversations carried out in person, wondering what it would be like to see your face when you laugh, to watch your hands as you pour tea with the same care you bring to writing letters. I am 54 years old, tall enough to reach the top shelves, but not so tall as to seem awkward in small rooms. My hair is more gray than brown now, and my hands show the calluses of a man who has worked with tools and machinery. I wake early and sleep lightly, habits formed during years when alertness might mean the difference between life and death. But these are just the surface details. What matters more is this: I have not felt truly known by another person since before the war. Your letters have reminded me what it means to be seen clearly, to have someone anticipate my thoughts and respond to them with intelligence and warmth. I would very much like to share afternoon tea with you, Eleanor, not because our correspondence is inadequate, but because it has been so rich that I find myself wanting to explore what other kinds of conversation we might share. If such a meeting would not be too forward, I could take the train to Wirrabara some Saturday. We could meet as friends who have found each other through circumstance and chosen to continue the acquaintance. With growing affection, Walter. Eleanor holds Walter's letter against her chest for a long moment before opening it, as if she could absorb its contents through proximity alone. When she finally reads his response, she feels her heart beating faster than it has in months. The possibility of meeting this man who has become so important to her fills her with equal measures of anticipation and terror. She spends a week crafting her response, starting and discarding several drafts. Finally, she settles on directness. Dear Walter, yes, Saturday the 23rd would be perfect. The morning train arrives at 10:30, and I will be at the station to meet you. I suggest we plan on afternoon tea at my house. I make a decent scone, and my garden is at its best this time of year. I confess I am nervous about this meeting in ways I had not anticipated. What if we find that our connection exists only on paper? What if the comfort we have found in letters translates poorly to conversation? But then I remember that courage has carried us both this far, and perhaps it will see us through whatever awkwardness might attend our first meeting. I am 57 years old, though I suspect you have already calculated this from the details I've shared about James's age. My hair is silver white now, pinned up in a style that has served me well for 20 years. I am neither tall nor short, neither fat nor thin, merely a woman of middle years who has learned to carry herself with what dignity she can muster. What I hope you will see in me is what I believe I have shown you in these letters. Someone who has been refined by sorrow rather than broken by it. Someone who still believes in the possibility of connection despite ample evidence of life capacity for separation. I will be wearing a blue dress and carrying a small basket, though I suspect we will recognize each other without such signals. After all, we are being introduced by our own words, which is perhaps the most intimate introduction possible. Until Saturday, Eleanor. As the appointed day approaches, both Eleanor and Walter find themselves in states of unusual preparation. Eleanor cleans her house with extra care, bakes fresh scones, arranges flower from her garden. She tries on 3 different dresses before settling on the blue one, then spends longer than usual arranging her hair. Walter makes the reverse journey, cleaning himself up for society after months of bachelor habits. He has his hair cut in Teroe, the nearest town with a proper barber, and spends time pressing his good suit. The night before his journey, he walks the 3 miles to the main road to catch the early bus to Adelaide, where he will connect with the train to Wirrabara. The journey gives both of them time to reconsider, to wonder if they are making a mistake that might destroy the perfect thing they have created through letters. But neither turns back. They have come too far, shared too much, to retreat into the safety of distance now. Chapter 2, Words That Found a Way, Through Silence. Saturday morning arrives with a peculiar clarity that sometimes attends significant days. Eleanor wakes before dawn, her body responding to an internal alarm calibrated by anticipation and anxiety. She dresses carefully in her blue frock, a shade that complements her silver hair and brings out the color in her eyes, though she tells herself such considerations are foolish vanity. At the railway station, she arrives 15 minutes early, her small basket containing fresh scones and a thermos of tea for the walk home. The platform is nearly empty except for old Mr. Patterson waiting for the goods train that will carry his wool bales to Adelaide. Eleanor positions herself where she can see the arriving passengers clearly, her heart beating with a rhythm that seems audible in the morning quiet. The train announces itself long before it appears, a distant whistle that carries across the Mallee scrubland like a promise. Eleanor has heard this sound thousands of times, but today it seems weighted with possibility. She smooths her skirt with hands that tremble slightly, wondering again if this meeting is a mistake that will complicate the perfect simplicity of their correspondence. When the train finally rounds a curve and slides to a stop with a great hissing of steam, Eleanor watches the few passengers disembark. A commercial traveler with his sample cases, Mrs. Morrison returning from visiting her sister in Adelaide, and then a tall man in a press suit, carrying a small traveling bag, looking about the platform with careful attention. Their eyes meet across 20 feet of weathered wooden platform, and Eleanor knows immediately that this is Walter. Not because he matches any physical description they might have exchanged, but because something in his expression, a quality of watchful intelligence mixed with carefully controlled vulnerability, corresponds exactly to the voice she has come to know through his letters. Walter recognizes her with equal certainty. The blue dress. Yes, but more than that, the way she carries herself, the particular attention with which he observes his approach, the small basket held with unconscious grace. This is the woman whose words have taught him to hope again, whose letters have made his exile from human connection seem not permanent but chosen. They approach each other with the formal courtesy of their generation, but underneath the social ritual, both are making rapid adjustments to accommodate the reality of physical presence. Walter is indeed tall, as he described, with gray-brown hair and intelligent brown eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles. His face shows the lines of a man who has lived through difficult experiences but retains kindness in his expression. Eleanor is smaller than Walter expected, more delicate in build, but there's nothing fragile about her demeanor. She moves with the confidence of someone accustomed to managing her own affairs, and when she extends a hand in greeting, her grip is firm and warm. "Mr. Ashworth," she says, and her voice carries the same careful precision as her handwriting. "Mrs. Ashworth," he responds, and they share a moment of gentle amusement at the coincidence of surnames that first brought them together. "Shall we walk?" Eleanor suggests. It's not far to my house, and the morning is perfect for seeing the township. They set off through Wirrabara's quiet streets, Their conversation beginning with the safe topics of travel and weather, but gradually warming as they discover that spoken words flow as naturally between them as written ones. Walter comments on the architecture of the older buildings. Eleanor points out the landmarks of her daily life. The post office where their letters cross paths, the schoolhouse where she taught for so many years, the church where she still attends services more from habit than conviction. It must be strange, Walter observes, to live surrounded by the scenes of your working life. I chose exile partly to escape such constant reminders. At first, yes, Eleanor admits, every street corner held memories. Every familiar face carried expectations about who I should be in my retirement. But gradually I found comfort in continuity. These places knew me when I was someone's wife, someone's mother, someone's teacher. Now they know me simply as myself, which is perhaps more honest. They reach Eleanor's cottage, a neat weatherboard house with a front garden that shows the care of someone who finds peace in tending growing things. The veranda is shaded by an old grapevine, and climbing roses frame the front door. Walter pauses to admire the careful arrangement of native plants mixed with traditional English garden flowers. You've created something beautiful here, he says, and Eleanor feels a flush of pleasure at his appreciation. Inside, the house reflects Eleanor's personality. Comfortable furniture arranged for reading rather than display, bookcases filled with well-worn volumes, and everywhere the small touches that make a house a home. Photographs of James at various ages occupy places of honor, but they don't dominate the space. This is the home of someone who has learned to live with memory without being imprisoned by it. Eleanor serves tea and scones on her best china, and they settle into conversation with surprising ease. The afternoon unfolds in a peculiar suspension of time that marks meaningful encounters, hours passing like minutes, yet each moment feeling distinctly precious. Walter tells her about his daily life at Ucolda Siding, describing the wildlife that has grown accustomed to his presence, the simple routines that structure his solitude. Eleanor shares stories of her students, her neighbors, the small dramas and comedies of country town life. But underneath these surface topics, they are conducting a more important conversation, learning to read each other's physical presence, confirming that the connection they built through letters can survive the test of shared space. May I ask, Eleanor says during a natural pause in their conversation, what you did during the war? I've shared so much about James, but I realize you've been more circumspect about your own service. Walter sets down his teacup with careful precision, and Eleanor sees something shift in his expression, not closing down, but gathering himself for a truth that requires effort to speak. I was a signalman on the Western Front, he says quietly. Communications were critical, keeping the lines open between command posts and the forward positions. I spent 2 years in trenches and dugouts, relaying messages that sent men to their deaths and occasionally brought them safely home. He pauses, looking out Eleanor's window toward the garden where afternoon light slants through the grapevines. The war took different things from different men. Some lost limbs, some lost faith, some lost the ability to sleep peacefully. What it took from me was the illusion that communication matters, that careful words can prevent catastrophe or create safety. I sent so many messages. Eleanor, precise, clear communications that led to such terrible outcomes. Eleanor reaches across the small table and briefly touches his hand, a gesture that carries volumes of understanding. But you were willing to answer my letter, she says softly. Despite believing that words might be meaningless, you chose to write back. That suggests a different kind of faith, doesn't it? Walter considers this, turning his hand palm up to briefly clasp her fingers before propriety requires him to withdraw. Perhaps you're right. Perhaps I'd lost faith not in words themselves, but in official words, orders and reports and telegrams. Your letters were different. They weren't trying to command or inform or convince. They were simply true, personal truth, offered without expectation of response. And yet you did respond. How could I not? Truth calls to truth, doesn't it? Even across great distances. Their conversation continues through the afternoon, ranging across topics both profound and mundane. They discover shared enthusiasms for certain authors, for the particular beauty of Australian landscapes, for the satisfying work of growing things. But more importantly, They confirm what their letters have suggested, that they understand each other in ways that don't require explanation. As the afternoon light begins to lengthen, Walter mentions that he should think about the return journey. The last train to Adelaide departs at 6 o'clock, and he needs to allow time for connections back to his remote siding. Must you return tonight? Eleanor asks, then quickly adds, I don't mean to be forward, but Wirrabara has a decent boarding house, and tomorrow is Sunday. You could attend church service, see more of the district. Walter considers the invitation carefully. Extended visits between unmarried people of their age require delicate navigation of social expectations, but the boarding house would provide appropriate propriety, and the chance to spend more time with Eleanor is deeply appealing. If you're certain it wouldn't cause talk, he says, I would very much like to stay another day. And so Walter Ashworth extends his visit by 24 hours, taking a room at Mrs. Crawford's boarding house and joining Eleanor for Sunday morning service at the Anglican church. The congregation notes the presence of Eleanor's visitor with the polite curiosity small towns reserve for strangers, but Walter's dignified demeanor and obvious respect for Eleanor earn him acceptance. After church, they walk to the cemetery where Eleanor's husband and son are buried. Walter stands quietly as Eleanor arranges fresh flowers on both graves, understanding that this introduction to her dead is a gesture of profound trust. I used to come here every day in the first months, Eleanor confides as they walk among the weathered headstones, talking to them, maintaining the graves as if perfect upkeep could somehow demonstrate the depth of my love. But gradually I realized they weren't here, not in any way that mattered. They live in my memory, in the stories I tell, in the letters I write to James. And now in the letters you write to me, Walter suggests gently, yes, somehow, sharing memories of them with you has made them more alive again, not less. I hadn't expected that. They returned to Eleanor's house for Sunday dinner, roast lamb with vegetables from a garden, prepared with the careful attention she once devoted to feeding her family. Walter insists on helping with the washing up, and Eleanor finds unexpected pleasure in this simple domestic collaboration. How long has it been since she shared such everyday intimacies with another person? As Walter prepares to depart on the Monday morning train, both recognize that something fundamental has shifted between them. Their correspondence will continue, but it will carry the added dimension of physical memory. The way Walter's eyes crinkle when he smiles, the precise way Eleanor arranges flowers, the comfortable silences that punctuated their conversations. This has been... Walter begins, then stops, searching for words adequate to the experience. Necessary, Eleanor finishes for him. It's been necessary, hasn't it, to discover that we are as real to each other in person as we have become on paper? Yes, and to learn that some risks are worth taking, even when we've grown comfortable with safety. They shake hands formally on the station platform, but there's nothing merely polite about the gesture. It carries the weight of everything they haven't quite said, everything they are still discovering about this unlikely connection. Over the following weeks, their letters resume with renewed warmth and an added layer of intimacy. They can now visualize each other clearly as they write. Walter at his simple table by the lamp, Eleanor at a kitchen table with the morning light slanting through her windows. Their words carry the memory of shared laughter, of comfortable silences, of the profound relief of being truly known by another person. Eleanor writes, I find myself remembering the smallest details of your visit. The way you held your teacup, the attention you paid to my garden, the respectful silence you maintained at the cemetery. These memories have become treasures, small bright things I can examine when the days feel too quiet. Mrs. Morrison asked me yesterday who my gentleman caller was, and I found myself momentarily speechless. How does one explain a relationship that began with mistaken mail and has grown into something that has no proper name? You are not a suitor in any conventional sense, yet you have become more important to my daily happiness than anyone has been since James died. I think we have invented our own category of connection, deeper than friendship, more honest than romance, built on the foundation of letters that dared to tell the truth about loss and loneliness. Whatever we call it, I treasure it beyond words. Walter responds, Your question about categories of connection has stayed with me for days. Perhaps the beauty of what we found is that it doesn't fit conventional definitions. We are correspondents, certainly, but also something more. Witnesses to each other's interior lives, companions in the careful work of making meaning from what remains after great loss. I have been thinking about your phrase, dared to tell the truth. Courage seems to be at the heart of what we build. The courage to write honestly to a stranger, to answer letters that weren't meant for us, to meet in person despite the risk of disappointment, to continue opening our hearts to the possibility of connection despite having learned how easily everything can be lost. Perhaps this is what mature affection looks like. Not the desperate passion of youth, but a considered choice to remain open to joy despite having intimate knowledge of sorrow. Their correspondence develops new rhythms and depths. Eleanor begins to share more about her daily life, not just the events, but her thoughts and feelings about them. She describes her increasing involvement in community activities, joining the Country Women's Association, helping with the annual church fete, taking on pupils for private tutoring. Walter writes about improvements to his living quarters, his expanding garden, his tentative reconnect ion with some of his old railway colleagues who occasionally pass through the district. But it's their philosophical conversations that give their letters their particular richness. They discuss books they are reading, share observations about the changing political landscape, explore questions about faith, purpose, and the possibility of happiness after profound loss. These exchanges reveal minds that complement each other beautifully. Eleanor's intuitive wisdom balancing Walter's analytical precision, his carefully reasoned observations illuminating her emotional insights. In July, Walter writes, I have been reading Wordsworth again, something I couldn't bear during the first years after the war, when all poetry seemed like beautiful lies. But your letters have restored my capacity for finding meaning in carefully chosen words, and I discover that the old verses can still move me. The mind of man is framed even like the breath out and harmony of music. There is a darker invisible workmanship that reconciles our discordant elements and makes a mover in one society. This seems to describe what has happened between us, some invisible workmanship that has reconciled two isolated lives, two separate griefs, and created what Wordsworth calls one society. We have become a society of two, united not by proximity but by understanding, not by shared history but by shared honesty about what history has taken from us. Eleanor's response reveals the depth of her own education and reflection. Your quotation from Wordsworth moved me to tears, not sad tears, but the kind that come when something beautiful names a truth you felt but couldn't express. Yes, we have become one society, and the workmanship that created it feels both invisible and miraculous. I've been thinking about the phrase discordant elements. We were both discordant in our separate ways, you with your chosen exile, me with my letters to a dead son. Neither of us fitting properly into the world as it's supposed to work. But somehow our particular forms of discord have created harmony when combined. Perhaps this is how healing works after great trauma. Not by returning to who we were before, but by finding others whose brokenness complements our own, whose scars tell stories that help make sense of our own pain. As autumn progresses into winter, their letters begin to carry hints of deeper longing. Not romantic passion exactly, but something more mature, the desire for daily companionship, for shared domestic routines, for the comfort of another presence in the face of life's uncertainties. Eleanor writes in late August, the nights are growing cold now, and I find myself thinking about the approaching winter with less enthusiasm than usual. It's not the cold itself I mind, but the long evenings alone, the echo of my footsteps in a house meant for more than one person. I catch myself wondering what it will be like to have someone to discuss the day's events with over evening tea, someone to read aloud to while the wind rattles the windows, someone whose presence would make the darkness feel less absolute. Not just anyone, of course, but someone who understands that companionship can be profound without being passionate, that intimacy can exist in shared silences as much as in conversation. I hope I'm not being too forward in writing such thoughts. The beauty of our correspondence has been its honesty, and I find I cannot be less than honest now, even if my thoughts venture into territory that might be considered improper for a woman of my age and circumstances. Walter's response comes quickly, and it carries a decisiveness that surprises them both. Dear Eleanor, there is nothing improper in longing for companionship, especially when that longing is expressed with such thoughtful dignity. Your letter has forced me to acknowledge something I've been avoiding, that my self-imposed exile at Ucolda siding has served its purpose and may now be doing more harm than good. I came here to escape the noise and expectations of conventional society, to find peace with my own ghosts. I have found that peace, largely through our correspondence, which has taught me that isolation and solitude are different things. Isolation is imposed by fear. Solitude is chosen for healing. I think I have healed enough to risk connection again. What I'm attempting to say, with less grace than the topic deserves, is this. Would you consider allowing me to return to Wirrabara not as a visitor, but as a resident? I could find lodgings, perhaps resume work with the railway in some capacity. I could be near enough to share those evening conversations you described, to help with winter preparations, to offer the kind of daily companionship that correspondence, however precious, cannot provide. I'm not proposing anything that would compromise your reputation or independence. We are both too old and too careful for impropriety. But I am proposing that we explore what one society might look like when conducted in the same geographical location, rather than across 23 miles of Mallee scrubland. If the suggestion is unwelcome, please tell me plainly, and our correspondence will continue unchanged. But if it appeals to you even slightly, I would welcome your honest thoughts on how such an arrangement might work. With deepest respect and growing hope, Walter. Eleanor reads this letter 3 times, each reading revealing new layers of possibility and complication. The practical considerations are significant. What would the town say about Walter taking up residence? How would they navigate the delicate social requirements of unmarried people, of their age maintaining regular contact? But underneath these practical concerns runs a current of joy so strong it frightens her. The prospect of Walter's daily presence, of conversations that don't have to wait for postal delivery, of shared meals and comfortable silences, and all the small intimacies of friendship. This appeals to her more than she had dared admit even to herself. She spends a week composing her response, walking through Wirrabara with new eyes, imagining how Walter might fit into the rhythms of her daily life. By the time she sits down to write, her decision is clear. Dearest Walter, your letter has turned my world upside down in the most wonderful way. Yes, absolutely yes, I would welcome your presence in Wirrabara. Not just for my own happiness, though I confess the prospect fills me with more joy than I felt in years, but because it seems the natural next step in whatever we are building together. I made some discreet inquiries about lodgings and opportunities. Mrs. Crawford has mentioned that she would welcome a permanent boarder of good character. Her establishment caters to commercial travelers and the occasional visitor, but a respectable gentleman resident would add stability to her business. The railway station is understaffed. Mr. Jenkins, the current station master, is past retirement age and would welcome competent assistance. As for social considerations, I think our age and established friendship would deflect most potential criticism. We are old enough to be beyond reproach and sensible enough to conduct ourselves appropriately. Any remaining gossip will pass when people see that we bring out the best in each other rather than causing scandal. But more importantly than these practical considerations, Walter, I want you to know that your presence would not just be welcomed, it has become necessary to my happiness. These months of correspondence have made me realize how much I have missed intellectual companionship, how much I have missed feeling known and understood by another person. Come home, Walter. Come home to Wirrabara, and let us discover what daily friendship looks like between two people who have found each other through the mysterious workings of mistaken mail and answered prayers. With all my love, Eleanor. But before Walter can arrange his relocation, their carefully constructed correspondence is interrupted by an event that tests the strength of what they built. Eleanor's letter of September 15 fails to arrive on its expected day. Walter waits through Wednesday, then Thursday, his anxiety growing with each passing hour. By Friday, he is convinced that something terrible has happened, that Eleanor has been taken ill, or has reconsidered her invitation, or has simply grown tired of their unusual relationship. He writes what he intends as a gentle inquiry. Dear Eleanor, when your usual Wednesday letter failed to arrive, I told myself not to worry. Postal service can be unreliable, especially during the spring rains. But now it's Friday, and I find I can think of little else except possible explanation for your silence. I hope I haven't presumed too much in my recent letters. If my suggestion about relocating to Wirrabara was unwelcome or inappropriate, please tell me directly. I would rather face clear rejection than torment myself with uncertainty. If, however, your silence is due to illness or other difficulties, please know that I am thinking of you with great concern. Our correspondence has become so central to my daily life that its interruption feels like a fundamental disturbance in the natural order. I will wait for your response with whatever patience I can muster, but please write soon, even if only to tell me that you are well. Your increasingly anxious friend, Walter. Meanwhile, in Wirrabara, Eleanor is experiencing her own form of torment. She has written her usual Wednesday letter, but young Billy Henderson, still occasionally helping with mail sorting, has misplaced it among a stack of commercial correspondence. The letter sits unsent in the post office for 3 days while Billy searches frantically for the missing mail that he knows is responsible for but can't locate. When Eleanor realizes her letter hasn't been posted, she experiences something close to panic. How will Walter interpret her silence? Will he think she's had second thoughts about his visit? Will their carefully constructed trust be damaged by this accidental breach in communication? She writes an emergency letter explaining the situation. My dear Walter, by now you must be wondering what has become of me and my usually reliable correspondence. I am mortified to tell you that my Wednesday letter, a long and cheerful response to your wonderful decision to come to Wirrabara, has been sitting unposted in our post office due to young Billy Henderson's well-meaning but inadequate filing system. I discovered this only this morning when I went to inquire about postal delays, and I cannot begin to tell you how distressed I am to think you've been worrying about my silence. Please forgive this accidental cruelty. I know too well how the mind can torture itself with unanswered questions to have subjected you to such anxiety deliberately. I am perfectly well, perfectly happy, and more eager than ever for your arrival in Wirrabara. My silence meant nothing except the unreliability of human systems and the particular chaos that young Billy brings to any task requiring organization. Please don't let this mishap shake your confidence in us or in the stability of what we are building. Some interruptions are meaningless accidents, not meaningful signs. I await your next letter with redoubled appreciation for the miracle of reliable communication between people who have learned to depend on each other's words. Your devoted and deeply apologetic correspondent, Eleanor. When Walter receives Eleanor's explanation, his relief is so profound it surprises him. He hadn't realized how completely he had come to depend on their regular exchange of letters, how thoroughly Eleanor's voice had become woven into his daily experience. The brief interruption has shown him something important. What they have built together is not just pleasant correspondence, but a genuine interdependence that enriches both their lives. His response carries new tenderness. Dearest Eleanor, your letter arrived like sunshine after storms, bringing relief so complete that I'm almost grateful for the temporary anxiety it resolved. The experience has taught me something I needed to know, that what we have created together has become essential to my happiness, not merely ornamental. Please don't apologize for poor Billy's filing mishap. If anything, I should thank him for showing me how thoroughly I have come to rely on your presence in my life, even at a distance of 23 miles. When I imagine losing our correspondence, I realize how much of my peace and purpose has come to depend on knowing you are there, reading my words, responding with your own careful thoughts. I have given my notice to the railway authorities and will conclude my caretaking duties at Ucolta by the end of October. Mrs. Crawford has confirmed that a room will be available for me beginning November 1st. Mr. Jenkins has agreed to meet with me about assisting at the Wirrabara station. Apparently my reputation preceded me and is eager for competent help. So you see, what seemed like a crisis was actually a confirmation. The temporary loss of communication only emphasized how much I value what we have built and how eagerly I anticipate building more. I will be home soon, Eleanor. Home to conversations that don't require postal delivery, to friendship that can unfold in real time, to whatever new discoveries await two people who have learned to trust each other with their deepest truths. With deepening love and growing anticipation, Walter. Chapter 3. A Station No Longer Abandoned. November 1st arrives with a particular clarity that marks autumn's deepest moments in the South Australian countryside. The morning air carries the scent of dust and dying grass, the promise of summer heat still months away, and Eleanor wakes with a sensation she hasn't felt in years, the anticipation of a day that will change everything. Walter's train is due at 2:30, carrying him not as a visitor this time, but as Wirabara's newest permanent resident. Eleanor has spent the morning in a state of barely controlled excitement, checking and rechecking the small preparations she's made. Fresh scones cooling on her kitchen bench, flowers arranged in her best vase, the good china set out for afternoon tea. These are the same rituals she performed before his first visit, but now they carry different weight. This is not preparation for a pleasant interlude, but for the beginning of whatever comes next. Mrs. Crawford has prepared Walter's room in the boarding house with extra care, fresh linens, a writing desk positioned by the window, a bookshelf waiting to hold his small library. The entire town, it seems, has developed a quiet interest in Eleanor's correspondence friend who has decided to make Wirabara his home. The story of their connection through misdelivered mail has spread with the gentle velocity that marks small-town gossip at its most benign. At the railway station, Eleanor arrives early again, but this time she's not alone. Several townspeople have found reasons to be present for the afternoon train. Mrs. Morrison collecting a parcel, young Billy Henderson hoping to glimpse the man whose letters he inadvertently redirected, even stern Mrs. Pemberton claiming to expect a delivery from Adelaide. Wirabara is preparing to welcome Walter Ashworth with the curious warmth that small communities reserve for newcomers who arrive with good references. The train approaches with its familiar whistle, but today the sound seems to announce not just another arrival, but the closing of a circle. Eleanor watches the steam dissipate as the locomotive slides to a stop, her heart beating with a rhythm that feels like music. Not the desperate flutter of anxiety, but the steady pulse of deep contentment. Walter emerges from a passenger car carrying 2 suitcases and a small trunk, his possessions contained in the modest baggage of a man who has learned to distinguish between necessities and conveniences. His dress and his good suit again, but there's something different about his bearing. Less careful, more settled, as if the decision to abandon isolation has freed him from the constant vigilance it required. Their greeting on the platform is watched with benevolent interest by half the town, but Eleanor finds she doesn't mind the attention. Let Wirabara see that 2 people can find each other late in life, that connection doesn't respect age or circumstance, that love, she allows herself the word for the first time, can take forms that convention doesn't anticipate. "Welcome home," she says simply, and Walter's smile transforms his entire face. "Home," he repeats, as if testing the word's weight and finding it perfectly balanced. The next weeks unfold with surprising ease. Walter settles into Mrs. Crawford's boarding house like a puzzle piece finding its proper place. His room becomes a comfortable retreat filled with books, letters from Eleanor carefully preserved in a wooden box, and the small personal items that mark a temporary lodging is genuinely occupied. His work at the railway station proves exactly what both he and Mr. Jenkins hoped. Walter's experience and steady temperament complement the older man's local knowledge perfectly. Together they manage the daily business of a country station with efficiency that earns approval from both the railway authorities and the townspeople who depend on reliable service. But it's the development of his friendship with Eleanor that provides the deepest satisfaction. They fall into routines that feel both natural and revolutionary. Afternoon tea twice weekly at Eleanor's house, Sunday walks through the countryside surrounding Wirabara, evening conversations that stretch long past propriety's usual boundaries. Their relationship puzzles some observers and delights others. They are clearly devoted to each other, yet they maintain separate residences and observe all social conventions. They share intellectual intimacy that surpasses many marriages, yet their physical contact rarely extends beyond the clasping of hands or Walter's gentlemanly assistance when Eleanor navigates rough ground during their walks. They are like an old married couple who've never been married, Mrs. Morrison observes to Mrs. Crawford over their weekly card game. Perhaps that's a secret. Mrs. Crawford responds with unusual insight. All the companionship without the compromises that wear away at younger marriages. Indeed, Walter and Eleanor seem to have discovered something that conventional relationships often miss: how to be completely themselves while remaining completely devoted to each other's happiness. Their letters taught them to communicate without pretense, and their daily interactions extend this honesty into shared experience. They read to each other in the evenings, taking turns with novels and poetry that deepen their mutual understanding. They gardened together, combining Eleanor's knowledge of local conditions with Walter's systematic approach to cultivation. They attend community events as an established pay, contributing their complementary skills to church fetes, school fundraisers, and the various projects that bind rural communities together. But perhaps most importantly, they create space for each other's grief without trying to heal it away. Eleanor still writes her occasional letters to James, though less frequently now that she has Walter to share her daily thoughts with. Walter still experiences days when the war's shadows seem particularly dark, when human noise becomes unbearable and he needs a healing silence of solitary walks. Their love, and by Christmas they both acknowledge it as love, accommodates these needs without resentment or insecurity. They have learned that mature affection doesn't demand the surrender of individual complexity but creates room for two complete people to share what they choose while maintaining what they need to keep private. In December, as the South Australian summer begins to assert itself with days of brilliant heat and nights of surprising coolness, Walter makes a suggestion that has been growing in his mind for weeks. "Eleanor," he says during one of their Sunday walks, "I've been thinking about our living arrangements." She stops walking, suddenly alert to possibilities she hasn't dared consider. "Oh, Mrs. Crawford's boarding house serves its purpose, but I find I'm tired of temporary quarters. I'm 54 years old, and if I'm going to make Wirra Bar my permanent home, I should establish myself properly." Eleanor nods, wondering where this careful preamble is leading. "I've been looking at the old Henderson place, the cottage behind the general store that's been empty since old Sam Henderson died. It needs work, but the bones are sound, and the garden has potential. More importantly, it's close enough to your house that we could share meals regularly, work in each other's gardens, spend our evenings together without the constraints of boarding house hours." He pauses, studying her face carefully. "What I'm suggesting is not improper. We would maintain separate households, separate reputations. But we would be neighbors in the truest sense, people whose daily lives naturally interweave." Eleanor considers this proposal with the same careful attention she once brought to reviewing students' work. The practical advantages are obvious. Walter would have his own space, his independence, while they could enjoy the kind of daily companionship that has become precious to both of them. Socially, the arrangement would raise no eyebrows. Neighbors helping neighbors is a foundation of country life. But more than practical considerations, Walter's suggestion appeals to something deeper in Eleanor's heart. The thought of waking each morning knowing he's nearby, of sharing the small domestic pleasures that make life rich, of growing old together without the compromises that formal marriage might require at their age. This seems like an ideal solution to the problem of how to love completely while remaining completely themselves. "Yes," she says simply. "Yes, Walter, I think that would be perfect." They spend the remainder of their walk planning modifications to the Henderson cottage, imagining how Walter's books might look on the shelves that need building, where Eleanor's surplus vegetables might fit in his future garden. By the time they return to town, they are talking like partners in a venture that extends far beyond housing arrangements. The cottage purchase is completed by February, and Walter spends the autumn and winter months of 1926 transforming the neglected property into something that reflects his particular combination of practical skill and aesthetic sensitivity. Eleanor helps with the planning and decorating, their collaboration creating a home that belongs unmistakably to Walter but shows everywhere the influence of someone who cares deeply about his comfort and happiness. By the first anniversary of their correspondence, marked by mutual agreement on the date Walter answered Eleanor's first misdirected letter, they have established a life together that satisfies both their need for companionship and their requirement for independence. They share breakfast most mornings, taking turns providing the meal at their respective kitchens. Eleanor continues her community involvement with Walter's support and occasional participation. Walter maintains the railway station's operations with Eleanor's help during busy periods, her teacher skills proving invaluable for managing paperwork and dealing with difficult travelers. Their evening ritual has become the highlight of both their days. After Walter finishes his station duties and Eleanor completes her household tasks, they meet in whichever garden is more inviting and share the day's experiences over tea and whatever small feast Eleanor has prepared. These conversations range across every topic: books they are reading, memories of their earlier lives, observations about their neighbors, plans for future projects. But sometimes they simply sit in comfortable silence, watching the light fade across the mellow countryside, listening to the evening sounds of a small town settling into night. These quiet moments carry as much intimacy as their most revealing conversations. The peace of two people who no longer need to explain themselves to each other, who have found in daily companionship a form of love that requires no grand gestures or dramatic declarations. On a warm evening in March 1926, as they sit in Eleanor's garden watching the last light catch the leaves of a grapevine, Walter reaches across the small space between their chairs and takes Eleanor's hand. "Do you ever regret it?" he asks quietly. "Answering that first letter, agreeing to meet, letting me upend your quiet life." Eleanor considers the question with characteristic thoughtfulness, her thumb moving gently across Walter's knuckles. "I regret very little in my life," she says finally. "The losses I couldn't prevent, the words I should have spoken sooner, the years I spent believing that safety was more important than connection. But this..." She gestures with a free hand toward the space between them, the gardens they've tended together, the life they built from letters and trust, and the courage to remain open to possibility. "This I would choose again, Walter. In every life, in every circumstance. What we've found together has made everything else worth surviving." Walter brings a hand to his lips and kisses it gently, not with passion but with reverence, the kind of tenderness that acknowledges how precious and fragile all human connection ultimately is. "I was lost when your letter found me," he says, living in an abandoned railway station, convinced that isolation was the only honest response to what I'd experienced. "You taught me the difference between running away and choosing carefully. You showed me that it was possible to build something beautiful from the ruins of everything I thought I'd lost." They sit in the gathering darkness, hands clasped, hearts full of gratitude for the mysterious workings of chance and choice that brought them together. Neither believes in ease of providence or romantic destiny, but both recognize that their love is a gift that arrived when they had stopped expecting gifts, a second chance that came disguised as mistaken mail. Above them, the Southern Cross appears in the deepening sky, the same constellation that has watched over countless love stories across the Australian continent. But tonight it seems to shine particularly bright over Wirrabara, over two people who found each other through letters that dared to tell the truth, who build a love that honors both connection and independence, who discovered that home is not a place but a heart that has learned to trust again. In the quiet aftermath of war and sorrow, sometimes the softest voices carry the greatest truths. If this tale of handwritten healing and late-blooming connection moved you, please like the video, subscribe for more stories from Australia's untamed heart, and share in the comments what part touched you most. We read every message, just like Eleanor read every letter, waiting for a sign she wasn't alone.